Clark Gable and Loretta Young's daughter should have grown up as Hollywood royalty. Instead, she spent most of her life believing she had been adopted, never knowing her real father was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. By the time she finally uncovered the truth, decades of lies had already changed her life forever. The first time she met her real father, she was 15 years old. She came home from school, and there was a man in the living room. She recognized him immediately. It was Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Seeing him in her mother's house was surprising, but not unbelievable. Her mother, Loretta Young, was one of Hollywood's biggest actresses, and famous visitors weren't unusual. He smiled. "You must be Judy." The two talked for about half an hour. He asked about school, her ballet lessons, and her life. Before he left, he gently cupped her face, kissed her on the forehead, and walked out the door. Judy believed she had just met one of her mother's famous friends. She hadn't. The man who had just kissed her goodbye was her father. He knew it. She didn't. Years later, Judy would finally learn the truth. By then, that brief meeting had become something she would never forget. So how did the daughter of Clark Gable and Loretta Young grow up without knowing who her own father was? To answer that, we have to go back to 1934, when two of Hollywood's biggest stars were brought together to film The Call of the Wild. But before that could happen, Clark Gable first had to become the biggest star in Hollywood. He was not born to be a king. He was born in a small Ohio town called Cadiz in 1901, and his mother died before his first birthday. So he entered the world, already missing something he would spend the rest of his life pretending he did not need. His father was an oil driller, a hard, practical man who thought acting was for softer creatures than the son he wanted. And young Clark grew up tall and gawky, with ears that stuck out, and hands that were more comfortable around machinery than around people. He worked in the oil fields. He worked in a tire factory. He was, for a long stretch, exactly the kind of ordinary working man who buys a ticket to the movies rather than the kind who ends up on the screen. What he had was hunger, and a face that the camera would eventually decide to love, and something harder to name, a way of standing in a room that made other people feel the room had a center now. But that came later, and it came slowly, and it came with a great deal of help. Here is the thing people forget about the king. He did not build himself. Women built him. He drifted into acting in his 20s, rough around the edges, and he was rescued and remade by a series of older women who saw the raw material and went to work on it. The first was an acting coach named Josephine Dillon, more than a decade older than he was, who fixed his teeth and lowered his voice and taught the oilfield boy how to move like a leading man, and then married him. When she had finished shaping him, he moved on. The next was Rhea Langham, a wealthy Texas socialite, older than him again, polished and moneyed, who gave him the surface of a gentleman and the connections of a rich woman's husband. He married her too. You can see the pattern already, and the pattern matters because it tells you what Gable did with intimacy. He treated it as a workshop. People were useful. Affection was real enough while it lasted, but it lasted about as long as the usefulness did. And then the king moved to the next room. He was warm and he was charming, and he could make you feel like the only person in the world. That 15-year-old girl in the living room would learn exactly how that felt. And underneath the warmth was a man who had learned before he could walk that the people you love disappear. So he got there first. He left before he could be left. By the middle of the 1930s, the workshop had produced its masterpiece. Clark Gable was the biggest male star in Hollywood, under contract to the mighty studio Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and he had just won the Academy Award for a comedy he had not even wanted to make. It happened one night in which he played a fast-talking reporter who teaches a runaway heiress how to hitchhike and how to fall in love. The man who could barely finish a sentence as a boy was now the standard American men measured themselves against, and the daydream American women measured their husbands against. When Gable took off his shirt in that film and revealed he wore nothing underneath, the story goes that undershirt sales fell across the country. That is the kind of power he had. A single unbuttoned shirt could move the retail economy. A single raised eyebrow could sell out a theater. He had gone from the boy whose own father thought acting was beneath a real man to the standard by which real men were now measured, and he had done it in about a decade, and the speed of it would have turned a steadier head than his. Men wanted to be him, women wanted him, and he moved through all of it with the easy confidence of someone who had decided a long time ago never to need anyone too much. He was married to Rhea Langham when the snow snow started falling on that mountain in Washington. The marriage was already more arrangement than romance, a respectable front for a man whose private life ran on its own rules. And everyone in Hollywood understood that Clark Gable's wedding ring was less a boundary than a decoration. He was 33 years old, he was the king, and he was about to spend 9 cold weeks trapped on location with a 22-year-old woman whose entire career depended on the world believing she was pure. That woman was Loretta Young, and to understand her, you have to understand that she had been performing since before she had a self to perform with. She was born Gretchen Young in Salt Lake City in 1913, into a family that fell apart early. Her father left when she was small, and her mother, Gladys, packed up her daughters and moved to Los Angeles, where she ran a boarding house to keep them fed, and pointed all 3 girls toward the one industry that was hiring pretty children. Gretchen was in front of a camera as a toddler. She was working steadily as a girl. By the time she was in her teens, she had a new first name, Loretta, chosen because it sounded like a star, and she had already learned the central lesson of her life, which was that a young woman survived by being lovely, being good, and being watched. She was breathtaking to look at. Everyone agreed on that, with a face the camera treated like a gift. And she had something rarer than beauty, which was discipline. Loretta Young worked. She showed up. She hit her marks. She protected her image with the seriousness of a woman guarding a bank vault, because she understood something the studios were only beginning to formalize. Her image was the product. She was not selling her acting. She was selling her virtue. And her virtue was not entirely a performance. This is where she gets complicated, and this is where you have to be careful not to make her a hypocrite, because she was not one. Loretta Young was a genuinely devout Roman Catholic. The faith was real. She went to Mass. She believed in sin and confession and the state of her own soul, and she believed these things not as decoration, but as the actual architecture of the universe. The wholesome girl the public adored, and the pious woman in the pew were the same person. That is precisely why what was coming would nearly break her. A fraud can survive a scandal. A believer cannot survive her own sin so easily. She was not, however, a naive girl. That is the contrast that makes her real. She had steel, and she had appetite, and she had already lived more than her image let on. At 17, she had eloped with an older actor named Grant Withers, a marriage the studio hated and quickly arranged to have annulled. So she knew already that Hollywood would rewrite your private life whenever your private life threatened the box office. And by the time she reached that snowbound mountain, she was carrying the fresh wound of another affair, this one with the married actor Spencer Tracy, a relationship that had ended and left its mark. She was young and she was religious, and she was also a grown woman who had loved men she was not supposed to love. All of that was inside her when Clark Gable started calling her his girl. So picture the two of them now, at the start of the winter of 1934 going into 1935, sent up to the Mount Baker region of Washington to make a picture called The Call of the Wild, based on the Jack London novel about a dog in the frozen north. He was 33, the biggest star in the world, married and constitutionally faithless. She was 22, single, Catholic, and famous for exactly the kind of purity that a pregnancy would destroy. And the studio, in its wisdom, sent them into the wilderness together and then let the weather lock the door. Because the weather did lock the door, this was not a normal shoot. The production was hammered by blizzards, snowed in for days at a stretch, the cameras freezing solid, the crew stranded in lodges with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Accounts describe roughly 9 weeks on that mountain, with only a scattering of days clear enough to actually film. Think about what that means. 9 weeks. 2 magnetic people, isolated, bored, cold, far from the studio's watchful eye, and the columnists and the wives, thrown together day after day with the snow piling against the windows. Gable took to calling out for my girl when he wanted her. The crew noticed. Everyone noticed. The chemistry between the king and the Catholic girl was not subtle, and in that white silence, it had all the time in the world to grow. Sit in that isolation for a moment, because the isolation is the whole engine of what followed, and it is worth feeling how total it was. The picture was directed by William Wellman, a tough, impatient filmmaker who had a war behind him, and a reputation for driving a production hard. And even he could do nothing against a mountain that would not stop snowing. Whole days went by with no usable light and no reachable locations. The roads closed, the equipment failing, a company of movie people stranded in lodges with time piling up around them, like the drifts against the doors. There was no studio nearby to answer to. There were no columnists lurking in the lobby. There were no wives, no priests, no publicity men counting the hours, a star spent with a co-star. There was a fire, and cards and drink, and the same handful of faces night after night. And outside the windows, a white nothing that made Hollywood feel like a rumor of another planet. Into that, put a 33-year-old man who had been taught since boyhood that charm was the tool you used to get what you wanted, and who was, at that exact moment, the most desired man in America. And across the fire, put a 22-year-old woman who had spent her whole life being told that her worth was her goodness, who was fresh from the wreckage of one forbidden romance, and who had the kind of beauty that made grown crews forget what they were doing. Gable was not shy about it. He took to calling out for my girl when he wanted her near, a small casual claim staked in front of everyone. And Loretta Young, who knew exactly how a good girl was supposed to hold a man like that at arm's length, found that arm's length is a very hard distance to keep across 9 weeks of firelight and boredom and snow. She would say later that performers often fall a little in love with the people they act beside, that it is almost an occupational hazard, the pretend feeling and the real feeling bleeding into each other under the lights. On that mountain, there were no lights for days at a time. There was only the pretend feeling with nothing to do but become real. You do not need a scandal to see how it happened. You only need to imagine the 10th evening or the 20th, the walls closing in, the king leaning close with that voice. The whole country swooned over, turned down low, and aimed at one person, and a devout young woman discovering that faith is a strong wall in a chapel, and a much thinner one in a snowbound lodge with a fire dying down. Whatever line she meant to hold, the mountain wore it down. It had all the time in the world to do it. What exactly happened between them, and how willing she was, is the one part of this story that has never been settled, and it is worth slowing down to be honest about it, because there are two very different versions, and the truth may lie in the gap between them. For most of the years that this story was told, the version everyone accepted was a romance, a brief affair, two beautiful people who fell a little in love in the snow and paid for it. That was how Loretta Young's own daughter would eventually describe it. That was how the authorized accounts framed it. A fling, a tryst, a mutual attraction that got out of hand. In that version, Young later told people that Gable had been the great love of her life, and that her deepest regret was that she had not married him. That is the story that held for decades, the doomed movie star romance, with a hidden child at the end of it. But there is a second version, and it did not surface until nearly everyone was dead. Late in her life in the late 1990s, when Loretta Young was in her 80s, she reportedly told her daughter-in-law, Linda Lewis, a different account. By this telling, whatever happened on the mountain was flirtation and nothing more, and the actual encounter came later, on the overnight train carrying the cast back to Hollywood, when Gable came into her private sleeping compartment. According to Linda Lewis, Young had watched a television program discussing the term date rape, had asked what it meant, had been told it described a situation where you trusted someone, and your no was not treated as a no, and had answered that this, near enough, described the thing that had happened with Clark. Now you have to hold that carefully. This account is secondhand. It came out only after both Loretta Young and Judy had died. It surfaced publicly in 2015 through a detailed piece of reporting, and it cannot be independently checked. There is no record from Young's own lifetime calling it an assault. It arrives decades late, through relatives, at a moment when the culture had finally built the language to name such things, and reasonable people have questioned how it fits with everything Young and her daughter had said before. It may be the truest thing she ever said about that night, spoken only when she finally had the words for it. It may be an old woman, reframing an old shame through a new vocabulary. We do not get to know for certain, and anyone who tells you they know is selling you something. What we can say is this. Whatever happened in that sleeping compartment She carried it as her own fault for the rest of her life. That part is not in doubt. A woman raised to believe that a good woman resists, and that failing to resist is her own sin, will blame herself for a thing that was done to her. And Loretta Young blamed herself with the full and terrible sincerity of her faith. She called what followed her mortal sin. She called the child when she finally spoke of her sin. She did not say his sin. She said hers. Hold on to that because it explains almost everything about the years to come. However it began, the result was the same. Loretta Young came down off that mountain pregnant, unmarried Catholic, and one of the most watched young women in America, and she was carrying the child of a married man who was, at that moment, the single most valuable male star in the motion picture business. There has rarely been a more dangerous secret in the history of Hollywood. To feel how dangerous, you have to understand the machine she was trapped inside, because it was not simply gossip she was afraid of. It was ruin, written into the paper she had signed. Every star of that era worked under a contract, and nearly every contract contained something called a morals clause. In plain terms, it meant the studio could tear up your career the moment your private behavior threatened the company's profits. Scandal was not a personal embarrassment. It was a breach of contract, and the specific scandal facing Loretta Young, an unmarried Catholic sweetheart pregnant by a married co-star, was close to the worst combination the system could imagine. It would not have dented her. It would have ended her. It might well have ended him too. And Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had a very large investment in Clark Gable and no intention of watching it evaporate over a baby. So the safe thing, the studio thing, the thing that had quietly happened to more young actresses than anyone will ever count, was an abortion. Discreet, arranged, denied. The problem disappears and the career survives and no one ever speaks of it. That was the path the system laid down in front of her, smooth and well-traveled, and everyone expected her to take it. She would not. This is the hinge of the entire story, and it is the thing that makes Loretta Young more than a cautionary tale. Her faith told her that ending the pregnancy was a mortal sin, a sin against God that would cost her her soul, and she believed that with her whole being. She had already, by her own reckoning, committed one grave sin to get into this position. She would not commit another to get out of it. Whatever else you think of the years of lying that followed, understand where they started. They started with a young woman refusing to kill her child, even though keeping it might destroy everything she had spent her life building. The lie was monstrous. The choice underneath the lie was, in its own way, an act of desperate integrity. But refusing the easy path meant she now had to hide a human being, and not for a night or a week, for years. She had to make a pregnancy invisible, make a birth vanish, make a baby appear out of nowhere with a clean story attached, all while remaining a working movie star whose face was in magazines. It was, on its face, impossible, and she nearly pulled it off completely. She did not do it alone. Behind Loretta Young stood her mother, Gladys, the boarding house woman who had built 3 daughters into a family business. And Gladys knew how to manage a crisis. The mother and the sisters closed ranks. This became a family operation, cool and coordinated, and its first job was to buy time and cover the early months. At first, that was manageable. In the beginning, a pregnancy hides itself, and Young kept working, finishing her commitments, appearing in public in the full skirts and clever costumes of the day, standing for photographs that gave nothing away. She had a picture to complete, the big historical spectacle, the Crusades, and she moved through her obligations with the outward calm of a woman with nothing to hide. Imagine the discipline that took. Every appearance was a performance with the stakes of her whole life riding on it. And she gave the performance flawlessly, smiling for the cameras while the secret grew inside her, and the clock ran down. Then the skirt stopped being enough, and she had to disappear. The cover story was illness, then rest, then a change of scenery. The vague, exhausted actress, language the studios and columnists trafficked in all the time. Loretta Young announced she was worn down, in need of recovery, and she left the country. She sailed for Europe, spent months largely in England, out of range of the Hollywood press, where a pregnant, unmarried starlet could walk down a London street and be nobody. Distance did the work that costumes no longer could. As long as she stayed away, there was no belly for a photographer to catch, no bump for a gossip to count backward from. And when she could no longer be seen at all, she came home quietly and vanished into a small house near the water in Venice, California, and prepared to give birth the way you would prepare to commit a crime. Picture that house in the autumn of 1935. The windows are covered, blankets and heavy cloth blocking the light, and more to the point, blocking any view in. Only a handful of trusted people know what is happening inside. A doctor sworn to silence, a nurse, her mother. The plan is total secrecy, and total secrecy during childbirth is a brutal thing to attempt, because childbirth is loud. By some accounts, the doctor used chloroform in part to keep her quiet, to muffle the sound of a mother bringing a child into the world so that no neighbor, no passerby, no curious eye would ever suspect what that ordinary rented house contained. There is a loneliness to that scene that is easy to miss under all the machinery of the cover-up. Somewhere in the house was Gladys, the mother, managing it the way she managed everything, calm and practical and unsentimental, because sentiment was a thing the family could not afford. There was a doctor being paid for his silence as much as his skill. There was no husband. There were no flowers, no cards, no telephone ringing with congratulations, none of the ordinary human noise that surrounds a birth, because the whole event was being conducted as if it were not happening at all. A young woman was becoming a mother in a rented house with the windows blinded, in a silence enforced by chemistry, with her own mother the nearest thing to a friend in the room, and she could not cry out, and she could not celebrate, and she could not, when it was over, pick up a phone and tell a single soul in the world that she had a daughter. She had to have the baby the way a thief has a getaway, quietly, quickly, and then get rid of the evidence. On November 6, 1935, in that blacked-out room, Loretta Young gave birth to a daughter. She was a healthy baby girl. She would be baptized under a name that shifted in the records, Mary Judith, Judith Young. The paperwork itself made deliberately slippery, because the birth certificate carried a false maternal name, and the baptismal records were arranged to point away from the truth rather than toward it. From her first breath, this child's official existence was a forgery. She was born into a cover story. Before she had a personality, a voice, a single memory of her own, she already had a fake identity built around her like a set on a soundstage. Somewhere in Hollywood, the king was told. Gable's reaction is one of the small, terrible details that tells you who he was in that moment. According to the account his daughter would later give, a telegram reached him about the birth, and he read it and he tore it up. And by one telling, he flushed the pieces away. Not from cruelty exactly, from self-protection, the same reflex that had run his whole life. A married man at the peak of his box office power, handed proof of a scandal. That could cost him everything. Did what he had always done when something threatened to need too much of him. He made it disappear. He got there first. He left before he could be left. He did, by some accounts, come to see the baby once or twice early on. There is a story, told by his daughter years later and impossible now to fully confirm, that Gable visited and found the infant sleeping in a dresser drawer for lack of a proper crib, and that he handed over some money so the child could have a real bed. If it happened, it is a strange and revealing gesture. The king of Hollywood buying a bed for a baby he would never claim. A flicker of fatherly instinct immediately folded back into cash and distance. He would not raise her, he would not name her, but he would apparently pay for the bed. It is almost the whole of him in one act. And then the baby was taken away, and the second phase of the concealment began, the part that is hardest to sit with, because now the secret was not a pregnancy. The secret was a person, and she had to be hidden too. A movie star cannot vanish from the screen forever. Loretta Young had a career to resume, an image to rebuild, a public waiting to be reassured that she was well and lovely and back at work. And a woman who has just secretly given birth cannot resume that life with an infant on her hip. So the child was moved out of sight and kept out of sight for what would become roughly the first 19 months of her life. She spent those months in the care of a nurse, and then in a Catholic institution, an infant's home in San Francisco, one of the church-run places where babies could be kept quietly and well away from the columns of Loretta Parsons and Hedda Hopper. Some accounts have her passed between more than one such place, moved when moving seemed safer. What is consistent across the tellings is the shape of it. For the first year and a half of her life, this little girl was a secret held in other people's arms, in rooms her mother did not live in, under a story that erased the woman who had carried her. Think about what is missing from those months. There are, by every account, no photographs of her first 2 years. None. In a family of movie people, in an era when a baby was the most photographed thing in any household, there is simply a blank where the pictures should be, because pictures were evidence, and evidence was the enemy. The absence is its own kind of record. Every other child in that world grew up inside a paper trail of birthdays and first steps and Christmas mornings, a whole archive of proof that they had been wanted and watched. Judy grew up inside a gap. The years that should have been the most documented of her life are the years no one was allowed to see, and the silence where the pictures should be says as much about what was done to her as any photograph ever could. It is the negative space in the shape of a hidden child. Consider what those first months actually were, not as a plot point, but as the lived experience of an infant. She was somewhere in San Francisco, in a church-run infant's home, one of the quiet institutions where the Catholic sisters cared for babies who could not, for one reason or another, be with their families. There would have been rows of cribs, capable and kindly women who were nonetheless caring for many children at once. The ordinary institutional rhythm of feeding and changing, and moving on to the next. What there would not have been, for this particular baby, was a single steady person whose whole heart she was, because the one person whose heart she should have been was 300 miles south, resuming a movie career, appearing slim and rested in the magazines, being photographed at premieres, letting the world believe she had spent her absence recovering from a vague illness. The mother was on screen. The daughter was in a crib in another city with a false name attached to her. And the visits, when they came like something illicit. A movie star cannot simply drive up to an orphanage and ask to see a baby without a story spreading. So Loretta Young came carefully, quietly, by some accounts under cover of darkness, slipping in to hold the child the world was not allowed to know she had, and then slipping out again before daylight and gossip could catch her at it. Whatever love was in those visits, and there was love in them, it reached the baby, wrapped in secrecy and hurry and fear. A mother who could only appear at the edges of her own child's life, at odd hours, unable to stay. The first thing that infant learned about being loved, before she could form a single memory of it, was that love arrived in the dark and did not remain. Her mother visited, but the visits, by the accounts that survive, came carefully, quietly, sometimes under cover of darkness. A movie star slipping in to see a baby the world was not allowed to know she had. Imagine the strangeness of that bond, forming in secret in stolen hours, the child learning the smell and the voice of a woman who could not be seen loving her in daylight. Whatever attachment grew there grew crooked from the start, twisted around a lie, and the child would spend the rest of her life feeling the crookedness without being able to name it. She could not stay hidden forever either. A permanently missing child is its own kind of question, and Loretta Young did not want questions. She wanted a daughter she could keep. So the plan moved into its final and boldest phase, the phase that turned a shameful secret into a public act of charity, and it required the willing help of the most powerful gossip columnist in America. In 1937, when the little girl was around 19 months old, Loretta Young let it be known through Loretta Parsons that she was adopting. Read that again slowly, because it is one of the strangest sentences in the history of the movies. To keep her own child, Loretta Young publicly pretended to adopt her, and she did it with real cunning. The first version of the story, planted in the friendly press, was that the tender-hearted Miss Young was adopting not one, but 2 little girls from a Catholic orphanage, opening her home to a pair of parentless children. Then shortly after, the story was amended. One of the adoptions had fallen through. The public was told, because the birth mother could not bear to part with her child after all. How touching, how human. Sit with the strangeness of what this asked of Loretta Young herself. To hold on to her daughter, she had to stand in front of the world and perform being a stranger to her. She had to let the newspapers praise her charity toward a parentless waif who was, in fact, her own flesh, carried in her own body, delivered in a blacked-out room she had rented for the purpose. Every warm word the public spent on her generosity was a word that pushed her further from the plain truth that this was her child. She could not say it. She would not be able to say it for decades. She had built a version of events so watertight that it locked her out too, sealed her away from the one relationship the whole scheme was meant to preserve, and she would spend the rest of her life on the far side of that seal, mothering her daughter through a wall of her own construction, permitted to be almost anything to Judy, except the one thing she actually was. There is a cost to a lie this total, and part of the cost is paid by the person telling it. She saved the child and lost the chance to ever simply have her, and she chose that trade with her eyes open, because in her accounting the alternative, exposure, ruin, the end of everything she had worked for, was worse. And how clever, because it did two things at once. It explained why only one child ended up in the house, and it quietly buried the most dangerous question of all. If Loretta Young had a single little girl who happened to be about 1.5 years old, someone might do the arithmetic and count backward to a certain snowbound film shoot. But a woman who had tried to adopt 2 orphans and sadly ended up with one, out of pure generosity, was not a woman anyone counted backward from. The lie about the second child was a decoy, and it worked. The smoke screen did its job. There were no real adoption papers filed for her own daughter, of course. You cannot legally adopt a child who is already yours. But no one checked, because no one wanted to, and because Louella Parsons had told America a warm story, and America had believed it. The forgery of the birth had been completed by the fiction of the adoption. The circle was closed. Loretta Young now had her daughter home, legally muddy, publicly explained, and permanently mislabeled. The daughter was given a name to grow up under. In time, when Young married the radio and advertising man Tom Lewis in 1940, the child would take his surname, and the world would know her as Judy Lewis, the adopted girl in the Loretta Young household. That is the name history mostly remembers. It was a name built on 2 men, a stepfather who gave the surname and never gave much else, and a real father whose name she was forbidden to carry. So here, at last, is the child restored to the house. A mother has performed a miracle of concealment and gotten her baby back under her own roof. You might think the hardest part is over. You might think the danger has passed and the wound can begin to heal. It is now that the real damage starts, because the secret did not end when Judy came home. The secret moved in with her, and it raised her. From the outside, Judy Lewis had a childhood most children would have traded anything for. She grew up in the big houses, Bel Air and Beverly Hills, with the fine clothes and the good schools, and the movie star mother who moved through the world like weather. There were nannies and drivers and beautiful rooms. If you had shown a stranger a photograph of that life, they would have seen a lucky little girl. But she was not raised by her mother. She was raised near her mother. That is a different thing, and a child feels the difference long before she can put it into words. Loretta Young was, above all, a working woman with a career to protect and rebuild, and the day-to-day raising of Judy fell mostly to a series of nannies. The mother was often away, often busy, often held at a slight distance even when she was in the same house, and the affection Judy hungered for was rationed out in a way she could never predict or earn. She spent her childhood reaching for a warmth that kept receding, and being a child, she did what children do. She decided it was her fault. The pattern started early, and it set hard. Her first nanny became the great love of her small life, the person who was actually there, the arms that actually held her. And then that nanny left, as employees do. And to a little girl, an employee leaving is not a staffing change. It is an abandonment. Judy took the loss and turned it inward. She began to wonder what she had done wrong, whether she had not been good enough, sweet enough, pleasing enough to make the person stay. She learned before she was old enough to read that love was conditional, and that keeping it was a performance you could fail. She would spend decades performing for a mother whose approval never quite arrived, always certain that if she could just be a little better, a little more lovable, the warmth would finally turn her way and stay. And then there was the matter of her face. Judy looked like Clark Gable, Not vaguely, unmistakably. She had his features stamped into her. And above all, she had his ears, those large prominent ears that had stuck out from the king's head before the studio taught him to manage them, the same ears that Oldfield Boy had grown up self-conscious about. On a movie star tamed and lit correctly, they read as rugged. On a little girl in a Beverly Hills household that was insisting to the world she was adopted, they were a signature. They were a confession stitched onto a child's head, visible to anyone who had ever seen a Gable picture, which was everyone. So the ears had to be hidden. Loretta Young gave orders that Judy's ears be kept covered in public, and the nannies obeyed, bonnets pulled low, hats arranged just so, hair combed forward and down, a whole small daily labor of concealment performed on a child's head, so that no photographer, no acquaintance, no sharp-eyed neighbor could look at those ears and look at Clark Gable and understand. She was a living clue, and she had to be edited every time she left the house. Children, of course, are less discreet than photographers. At school, the other kids saw the ears just fine, and they did what children do with a difference. They gave her a name. They called her Dumbo, after the cartoon elephant whose ears were too big for his body, and they said it the way children say these things, without mercy, day after day. She was a movie star's daughter who was teased for looking like the biggest movie star in the world, and no one, least of all Judy, understood the terrible joke. Think about what that does to a child's sense of her own body, day after day. Before she was old enough to know why, Judy learned that her own face was a problem to be managed. Her ears were wrong. They had to be hidden. There was a right way to comb her hair, and a right kind of hat, and a whole quiet vigilance about how she could be seen. And though no one ever explained it to her, she absorbed the lesson underneath it, which was that some part of her was dangerous. Some part of her had to be kept out of sight. Some part of her was a mistake that the grown-ups were forever tidying away. A little girl does not need to understand the reason to feel the shame. She only needs to feel the hands adjusting the bonnet over and over, and to hear the other children laughing, to conclude that there is something about her that is not allowed. She grew up believing, at a level below words, that she was made partly of a thing that had to be corrected. And she was right, though the thing was not her ears. The thing was her father, and her ears were only where he showed. When she was about 7, Loretta Young had the ears surgically pinned back. It was presented as a kindness, a way to spare a teased child more teasing, and perhaps that was part of it. But it is impossible to look at the timing and the target and not see the other reason. The surgery removed the single most visible piece of evidence linking Judy to Gable. It edited the confession off her head permanently. Around the same time, she had dental work to fix an overbite, another feature to be corrected, another line of resemblance to be softened. The child's face was being revised. And here is the detail that will stay with you, because Judy told it herself, and it is almost unbearable. She remembered that surgery, that painful recovery, as one of the happiest stretches of her childhood. Not because of the pain, because for once while she was healing, her mother was there. Loretta Young sat with her, attended to her, gave her the undivided attention she starved for the rest of the time. A little girl had to be cut and stitched to finally get her mother to stay in the room, and she decided the pain had been worth it, because it bought her something she could not otherwise buy. Picture the room. A small girl with her head wrapped, both ears bandaged flat against her skull, lying still because moving hurt, and beside the bed, for once, her mother. Not the mother who swept off to the studio before breakfast. Not the mother who was always somewhere else, behind a closed door, in the middle of an important call on her way out. This mother stayed. This mother sat close and smoothed the blanket and was simply there hour after hour, in a way Judy had wanted her whole short life, and almost never got. A child keeps accounts without meaning to. She learns where the warmth comes from and what it costs, and she files it away, and she will spend decades spending down what she learned. Lying in that bed, sore and swollen and quietly happier than she could remember being, Judy learned the equation that would shape her for years. To be hurt was to be attended to. To be wounded was to be worthy of her mother's time. She did not have the words for it, of course. She only knew that this was the good part, the bandages and the aching and the stillness, because it came with the one thing she could not get any other way. Years later, grown, trained to understand exactly what she was describing, she would still call it one of the happiest times of her childhood, and she would say it plainly, without drama, which is what makes it land like a blow. That is what emotional hunger does to a child. It teaches her that suffering is the price of love, and it teaches her to consider the price fair. The house grew more complicated when Judy was around 4 or 5, when Loretta Young married Tom Lewis, the radio producer whose name Judy would carry. For a little while it seemed like an addition rather than a subtraction. Tom Lewis at the start paid attention to the girl. He gave her books. He gave her ballet slippers. There was, briefly, the shape of a father in the house. Then Loretta Young had 2 sons with him, Christopher and Peter, and the shape changed. Now there were biological children in the home, the couple's real sons, and there was Judy, the adopted daughter. And the line between them was not something anyone had to draw out loud, because Judy could feel it in the air. Tom Lewis, by her account, cooled toward her, treated her with a hardness she could not understand and did not deserve, favored his own boys in the natural way of a man who did not know, or did not care to remember, that the odd girl out was anything but a charity case his wife had taken on. He had never legally adopted her. He had never been told the whole truth. To him, on some level, she may simply have been the strange addition that came with the marriage, and he treated her like it. Judy became the outsider inside her own family, the adopted one, the half-belonging one. She learned to move carefully, to make herself small, to keep her fears to herself, because she did not feel she could bring them to her mother without becoming a burden. And a burden was the last thing she could afford to be, when her whole security depended on being wanted. So she swallowed it. She swallowed all of it, and running under all of it, the thing she could not see but felt every day, was the lie about who she was. When Judy asked the questions children ask, the questions came back empty. When she wanted to know about her real parents, why her birth mother had given her away, who she had come from, the answers were evasions dressed as tenderness. There was a line Loretta Young used, and it is a masterpiece of loving deflection. She would tell Judy that she could not possibly love her any more than she did, if Judy were her very own child. Sit with that sentence. It is warm, it sounds like reassurance, and it is a wall. It closes the door on the question, without ever answering it, and it does so in language so affectionate that the child cannot even feel the door close. Judy heard "I love you like my own." What she was actually being handed was "you will never get the truth from me." She simply could not tell the two apart, because they were spoken in the same gentle voice. As for her father, she was told the simplest lie of all. He was dead. The nannies were instructed to tell her that her father had died. And so she grew up a fatherless girl, mourning a man who did not exist, while the man who did exist walked around as the most famous face on earth. She was told to grieve a phantom, so she would never look for the real one. The truth, meanwhile, was everywhere around her except inside her own head. That is the cruelest architecture of this whole story. It was not a secret that only 2 or 3 people knew. It was, in Hollywood, an open secret. The timing, the resemblance, the sudden adoption, the ears. The whole thing was common knowledge. Among the people her mother worked with, and the families her friends came from. Grown-ups knew. Other children's parents knew. Her own school friends in many cases had been told the story at home, and then instructed not to breathe a word of it to Judy. She moved through a world where nearly everyone she met knew the central fact of her existence, and every one of them had been sworn to keep it from her. She was the only person not in on the secret of her own life. There is a detail here that captures the strangeness of it perfectly. Judy's high school boyfriend was a young man named Jack Haley Jr., the son of the actor who had played the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, a boy raised deep inside the movie world. He knew who Judy's father was. Everyone in his circle did, and he later remembered how eerie it was to sit in a dark theater beside her, watching a Clark Gable picture, watching Gable up there on the screen, and to feel the words pressing at his teeth. "That's your father, that's your dad," and to say nothing. She sat in the dark and watched her own father act, the way millions of strangers did, and the boy beside her held the truth in his mouth and did not let it out. That happened more than once, in one form or another, to that girl. She was surrounded by people carrying her own story, and the weight of all that withheld knowledge pressed the truth down and out of her reach. What does that do to a person? Judy spent the rest of her life describing the answer, and the phrase she kept returning to was that she felt like half a person. Not sad exactly, not only sad. Incomplete, unreal, as though some essential part of her had never been switched on, as though she were a stranger wearing her own life. She felt fatherless and unclaimed, and permanently on the outside of a belonging that everyone else seemed to have by birth. She could not have told you why. She only knew that something was wrong at the center of her, a wrongness she carried into every room, and that no amount of privilege or prettiness touched it. This is the quiet, grinding damage that a secret does to the person it is kept from, and it is worth naming plainly, because it does not look like abuse and does not leave marks, and is almost impossible to prove or point to. No one hit her, no one starved her. She had the fine clothes, and the good schools, and the beautiful rooms. And if she had tried to explain to anyone that she felt hollow, unreal, permanently on the outside of her own life, they would have looked at the clothes and the rooms and told her how lucky she was. That was the trap. The wound was invisible, and its invisibility was part of the wound, because a pain that no one can see is a pain you begin to think you are inventing. She spent her childhood suspecting that the wrongness was her own fault, some defect in her capacity for happiness, when in fact it was the exact and predictable result of being raised inside a lie about her own existence. Her mind, unable to hold the contradiction between the loving words and the withheld love, between the story she was told and the truth she could feel humming underneath it, did the only thing a child's mind can do with a pressure like that. It began to seal rooms off. Whole stretches of her early life simply went dark, filed away somewhere she could not reach, and she would not get them back until she was an adult sitting in a therapist's office, prying open one sealed door at a time, discovering that the emptiness she had always felt was not emptiness at all. It was a locked house, full of rooms, and every one of them had her name on the door. She was a girl who did not know her own name was invented, who mourned a living father, whose face had been surgically edited to hide her parentage, who reached daily for a mother who kept stepping back, and who lived inside a secret so complete that the whole town could see her clearly, while she could not see herself at all. She grew up, she was beautiful like her mother, she was watched like her mother, and she carried, without knowing its shape, the exact weight of the thing everyone had decided she must never learn. And then, one ordinary school afternoon when she was 15, she came home and found a man in the living room. We are back where we started now, but you know things she did not. It was around 1950. Gable and Loretta Young had been thrown together again by the studios, this time on a picture called Key to the City, working side by side once more, 15 years after the snow. And at some point during that stretch, Gable came to the house in Beverly Hills where his daughter was living under another man's name, believing her real father was in the ground. She walked in from school and there he was, the king in the flesh in her mother's living room, and she felt only the ordinary thrill any teenager would feel at finding a legend in the house. No more than that, because she had no reason to feel anything else. He greeted her by name. "You must be Judy." They sat. He asked her about herself with what she remembered as real interest, her school and her ballet and her boyfriends, and the ordinary weather of a 15-year-old's life. And she talked, flattered and a little dazzled, to this enormous famous stranger who was giving her his whole attention. For half an hour, maybe more, a father and daughter sat together and talked, and only one of them knew it. He knew, make no mistake about that. Gable knew exactly who this girl was. He had torn up the telegram. He had, by some accounts, once bought her a bed. 15 years had passed, and here she was, half-grown with his ears pinned back, and his features softened by a surgeon, and her mother's careful revisions, sitting across from him and telling him about her ballet lessons. Whatever went through him in that room, he did not show it and he did not say it. He performed the part of the kindly family friend, the way he performed everything, the way his whole life had trained him to perform, getting close enough to feel it and never close enough to be caught. And then he did the one thing he let himself do. He stood to leave, and he took her face in both of his hands, and he kissed her on the forehead. It was the single most tender thing he would ever be permitted to give her, and he gave it as a goodbye, because he had already decided, or had already let her mother decide. That goodbye was all this would ever be. He walked out the door. She never saw him again. She never spoke to him again. She had just met her father for the only time in her life, and she did not know it, and he would not tell her. And the door closed behind him with a soft Beverly Hills click. Years later, when she finally understood what that afternoon had been, the memory changed shape in her hands. It became the most precious thing she owned and the most painful, both at once. He had been interested in her. He had looked at her and asked about her and held her face and kissed her. And some part of him, the part that once bought a bed, had wanted to. And still he said nothing. And still he left. And still he chose the silence he had chosen since the day the telegram arrived. The kiss on the forehead was real. So was the walking away. Those were the two halves of the man. And Judy got exactly one afternoon of each. She kept that kiss for the rest of her life. It was almost the only thing he ever gave her that she could hold. 10 years later, in November of 1960, Clark Gable died. He had just finished a hard film in the desert, a picture called The Misfits, doing his own physical work in the heat, and his heart gave out not long after. He was 59. The king was gone, mourned by the whole world, and among all the millions who grieved him, there was a young woman in her 20s, who had every reason to grieve him more than anyone, and did not yet fully know why. He died without ever once claiming her, in public or in private. No letter came, no acknowledgement, no place in a will. He took the secret into the ground, with the same discretion he had shown the telegram, and he left his daughter exactly as he had found her, unclaimed. It is easy to make him the villain here, and easy is not the same as true. So it is worth asking what was actually in Clark Gable, because a man is not only the sum of his silences. Here is a thing about him that makes the silence harder, not easier. Gable wanted children. He wanted a family badly. And it was one of the great sorrows of his life that it kept not happening. The love of his life, by most accounts, was the actress Carole Lombard, whom he married after Rhea, the one woman who seemed to reach the actual man underneath the king. And she was killed in a plane crash in early 1942. While selling war bonds, and it broke something in him that never fully mended. She had gone home to Indiana to raise money for the war, and she was flying back to him, and the plane came down against a mountain in Nevada, and everyone aboard was lost. He went out to that mountain himself while the recovery went on. Whatever he saw there, he carried the rest of his life. What he did next tells you something about the size of the wound. He was past 40, the biggest star in the world, exempt by age and value from any real danger, and he enlisted anyway. He put on a uniform and trained as a gunner and flew combat missions over Europe, in the open, in real airplanes with real flak coming up at them, and there were people around him who quietly believed he was not being brave, so much as trying to follow her, that some part of him would not have minded if a shell had found him. He came home. The war did not take him the way it had taken her. But the man who came back was older than his years, heavier, drinking, a little switched off behind the eyes, still magnificent on a screen and increasingly hollow off it. He kept reaching for the family he wanted. He married again, and it did not fill the hole. He was a man who had found the one thing he was looking for, and lost it in a single phone call. And everything after that was a man trying to walk it off. He wanted a child with her and never had one. He married again. And again, still reaching for the family that eluded him. And at the very end, his last wife was pregnant when he died, so that his only acknowledged child, a son, was born a few months after his father was already in the ground and never met him at all. Hold those facts next to the girl in the living room. Here was a man aching for fatherhood, who had lost the woman he loved most, who would die before his own son could see his face. And all the while he had a daughter, alive, half-grown, sitting across from him talking about ballet, and he could not or would not reach across that small distance and take her. Whatever kept him from it, cowardice or contract or loyalty to Loretta, Young's terrible bargain, or simple, lifelong habit of leaving before he could be left. It was not that he did not care about children. He cared about children. He just could not let himself have this one. That is a sadder thing than cruelty. Cruelty would at least have been simple. So Gable died, and the door that had opened for half an hour in a Beverly Hills living room closed for good. And now there was only one person left alive, who could tell Judy the truth about herself. The trouble was, that person had spent her entire life refusing to say it. The first crack in the wall had actually come while Gable was still alive, a couple of years before he died, and it came from an ordinary source, the way these things often do. Not a deathbed confession, not a dramatic reveal, just a fiancé assuming she already knew. Judy was 23, and she was engaged to a young television man named Joseph Tinney, and she was, as the wedding approached, quietly coming apart. It was the kind of crisis that looks like cold feet from the outside, and is something much deeper underneath. She told him she was not sure she could marry him, and the reason she gave was strange and true. She said she could not marry anyone because she did not know who she was. She knew nothing about herself, nothing about where she came from, nothing real about her own beginnings. And how could a person promise her whole life to someone else when she was, at the core of her, a blank? And Joseph Tinney, trying to comfort her, said the thing that changed everything. He told her gently, as though he were simply reminding her of something obvious, that of course she knew who she was. It was common knowledge. Her father was Clark Gable. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew that. Imagine hearing those 3 words at 23. Not the fact alone, though the fact was earthquake enough. The everybody. The revelation that the thing she had spent her whole life not knowing was a thing the whole world had known all along. That the mystery at the center of her was, to the people around her, so unremarkable that her own fiancé assumed she was already aware of it. The loneliness of that is hard to hold. She had been the last to know the most important thing about herself, and she found it out by accident from a man trying to soothe her nerves before a wedding. And it reached backward through her whole life and rearranged it. Every friend who had ever been kind to her, every adult who had ever looked at her a beat too long, every silence that had ever fallen when she walked into a room, all of it took on a second meaning now. They had known, the teacher had known, the friend's parents had known, the boy who took her to the movies had sat beside her knowing. She had spent her childhood feeling vaguely, wordlessly watched, and now she understood that she had been watched, that the whole time there had been a fact about her floating in the air of every room she entered, visible to everyone but her. It is one thing to carry a secret. It is another to discover that you were the only one who did not know it was being carried, that you had been walking through the world as the subject of a story everyone else had already read. After that, how do you trust a kind word? How do you know whether someone likes you or is simply being careful around the thing they know and you do not? That is part of what Tinney handed her along with the truth, a suspicion that would take years to work through, the sense that the people around her had always been managing her rather than knowing her. She was stunned. And then, having been handed the truth, she did the thing that tells you the most about the damage already done. She did nothing with it. She did not go to her mother. She did not confront anyone. She folded the knowledge up and put it away and left it there because she was too afraid, losing her mother. Her bond with Loretta Young was thin and conditional and precious. The thing her whole childhood had been organized around protecting, and she understood on some deep level that to walk up to that woman and say I know, to force the secret into the open, was to risk shattering the little she had. So she carried the truth in silence, the way everyone else in her life had carried it in silence. And the years went by, and Gable died in 1960, still unclaimed by her and unclaimable. And she said nothing, and she married and had a daughter of her own, and worked as an actress in television. And still she said nothing, and the wrongness at the center of her did not lift because a fact in a drawer is not the same as the truth spoken out loud. It took her until she was 31. It took years of therapy, the slow, patient work of trying to reach the blacked-out rooms in her own memory, before she found the strength to go and ask the question directly. And even then, it was less a decision than a breaking point. The moment when carrying it silently finally became harder than the risk of speaking. In September of 1966, over the Labor Day weekend, Judy went to see her mother. They had dinner. They watched a movie, the ordinary domestic evening of two women who had never once been ordinary with each other. Picture the strangeness of those hours. Judy had flown across the country carrying a question 31 years in the making, a question she had known the answer to since she was 23, and had been too frightened to ask ever since. And she had to sit through a normal evening with it lodged in her throat. She had to make small talk. She had to eat and comment on the food, and watch a movie flicker in the dark beside the woman who had hidden her in an orphanage, and hold the whole enormous thing inside, while the ordinary domestic evening went on around it. Everything in her had been built, since infancy, to avoid exactly this moment, to keep the peace, to not be a burden, to protect the thin thread of connection to her mother by never pulling on it too hard. And now she had come 3,000 miles to pull on it, as hard as it could be pulled. The years of therapy were behind her, patient work in a quiet office, learning that the fog in her memory had a cause, and the wrongness in her chest had a name, and that she could not become whole while the central fact of her life remained a thing she was forbidden to speak. So she waited until the movie was over, and afterward Judy asked her mother, straight out, whether Clark Gable was her father. What happened next is the closest thing this story has to a confession, and it did not come easily. Loretta Young became physically ill. She got up, she went to the bathroom, her body rebelling against the question before her mouth could answer it. Because for this woman the truth was not merely a secret, it was a sin. And to speak, it was to reopen the one wound her faith had never let her close. And then she came back, and she told her daughter the truth for the first and only real time in both their lives. The exact words have come down slightly differently in different tellings, and Judy herself recorded them in her memoir years later, but they carried the same freight however they were phrased. Young asked her daughter how she would feel if Clark Gable were her father, and then confirmed that he was. And in describing what Judy was to her, she reached, as she always reached, for the language of her church. She called Judy her sin, a walking mortal sin by one account. Not her joy, not her secret treasure, her sin. You have to understand that this was not meant as cruelty, even though it landed as one of the hardest things a mother can say to a child. To Loretta Young, it was theology. It was the literal truth of her universe. The circumstances of Judy's conception were, in the accounting of her faith, a grave sin, and Judy was the living result of that sin. And so, in the terrible logic of a devout and guilt-ridden woman, the child was the sin made flesh. She was not saying you are bad. She was saying you are the proof of the worst thing I ever did, and I have had to look at that proof across the breakfast table every day for 30 years. It was honest. It was, in its way, the most honest she had ever been, and it told Judy, at last, exactly why the warmth had always receded, why the mother had always stepped back, why love in that house had always come rationed and conditional. She had been raised by a woman who could not look at her without seeing her own damnation. They talked for hours that night. Young laid it out, the affair or the encounter, the concealment, the choices she had made, the fear that had driven all of it. It was the one long, true conversation they would ever have on the subject. And at the end of it, she asked her daughter for the same thing she had demanded of everyone for 3 decades. Silence, keep it secret, do not tell. She would not, could not, own it publicly, not while she lived, because to say it aloud to the world was to confess the mortal sin to the world, and that she was not able to do. So Judy walked out of that conversation, holding 2 things at once, and they did not fit together, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to make them fit. The first thing was relief, and it was enormous. For 31 years, Judy had felt like half a person, and now, suddenly, she had the missing half. She had a father. She had a mother who had finally admitted she was a mother. The blank at the center of her had a shape at last. She later described the moment of confirmation, as though she had walked straight through a mirror into a place where she was finally whole, saying that she had spent her life living on one side of the glass, living half a life, and now she had 2 parts of herself and could begin to be a full person. The truth, even a truth this painful, was a kind of homecoming. She had wondered her whole life why she felt like a stranger in her own skin, and now she knew, and knowing was better than the fog. Anything was better than the fog. But the second thing came right behind the relief, and it did not leave: grief. Because the truth she had won did not give her a father. It gave her the exact measurement of what she had lost. She now knew that the kind man in the living room, the one who had held her face and kissed her forehead and walked away, had been her own father choosing to walk away. She now knew that the star she had watched in dark theaters, The man her boyfriend had wanted to point at had been hers, and that he had died 6 years earlier without ever letting her call him what he was. She had spent her childhood mourning a father who was said to be dead, and now she got to mourn him a second time correctly, and it was worse the second time, because this time she knew his name and his face, and the sound of his voice asking about her ballet lessons. And she had to grieve the mother too, the living one, sitting across from her, who had chosen career and image, and the terrible arithmetic of her faith over the simple act of raising her daughter as her daughter. She got the truth, and the truth was a door that opened onto a hallway of everything that had been taken from her. That is the ruin buried inside every one of these secrets. When the lie finally breaks, it does not undo the years. It only lets you see them clearly for the first time, all of them, laid out end to end. She kept her promise, at first. For years after that night, she held the secret her mother had begged her to hold, and the two of them went on in their careful, wounded orbit, close and not close, the truth now shared between them, but still locked in the same silence that had shaped everything. Judy had a life to live. She had been an actress, working steadily in television, in soap operas like The Secret Storm and General Hospital, the daytime dramas, where so many capable performers made their living, and she had a daughter of her own to raise. And she was slowly, through years of therapy, doing the hard interior work of becoming a whole person after a lifetime of being half of one. And that work led her somewhere unexpected, somewhere that turned the whole tragedy inside out. Judy went back to school. She trained in time as a psychotherapist, a marriage and family specialist, and she chose, out of all the fields she could have chosen, to work with foster care, with adoption, with families built on separation and secrecy and children who did not know where they came from. She took the exact wound of her own childhood and made it her profession. The girl who had been hidden in an orphanage and passed between caretakers and raised on a lie about her own origins grew up to spend her days helping other people through the very kind of loss she had lived. She knew that terrain from the inside. She had walked every foot of it, and she turned it, deliberately and with great effort, into something that could help. That is not nothing. In a story this full of concealment and damage, that is very close to grace. But she was not done with the secret, and the secret was not done with her, because there came a point when keeping it silent stopped feeling like loyalty and started feeling like a continuation of the very lie that had nearly hollowed her out. She had children and grandchildren now, a family tree with the trunk sawed off, and Judy came to believe that the silence was not hers to keep forever. She had spent her whole life as the object of other people's secrecy. She decided she would not pass it down. She would break the chain before that break came fully into the open, though there was one more terrible scene between mother and daughter, and it landed, of all days, on Mother's Day. It was 1986. By this point, Loretta Young had come to fear, rightly or wrongly, that Judy was going to tell the story publicly, that a book was coming, that the thing she had guarded for 50 years was about to be spoken aloud to the world. And the fear turned to fury. In the version that has come down, Young confronted Judy and ordered her out of the house, told her she never wanted to see her again. The full weight of a mother's rejection brought down on a daughter's head one more time, and Judy, who had swallowed so much for so long, finally did not swallow it. Years of held-down pain came up at once. She asked her mother the question that had been sitting under everything, the question of a child who had always felt like a burden and an outsider and a sin. If you could not love me the way I needed, she wanted to know, why did you not give me to a family who could? Why keep me, only to keep me at arm's length? Why hold on to a child you could not hold? There is no good answer to that question, and Loretta Young did not have one, because the honest answer was tangled up in her faith, and her guilt, and her image, and her genuine, complicated, insufficient love, and none of those things could be said cleanly to the face of the daughter they had wounded. So the two women broke apart, and stayed broken for years. In 1994, Judy Lewis published her memoir. She called it Uncommon Knowledge, and with it she finally did the thing her mother had spent a lifetime preventing. She told the world the truth. She laid out the affair and the concealment, the secret birth and the orphanage, the false adoption planted in Louella Parsons' column, the bonnets and the pinned ears, the one meeting with her father, the confrontation with her mother, the whole long architecture of the lie, and what it had cost the child at the center of it. It would have been easy for that book to be an act of revenge, and it is worth noticing that it was not. Judy wrote it as what she had become, a therapist looking clearly at a damaged family system, including her own place in it. She was hard on her mother where the truth demanded it, honest about the emotional distance and the vanity, and the way the secrecy had bent everything out of shape. But she also understood the pressures that had produced it. She knew what the morals clauses could do. She knew what an out-of-wedlock pregnancy in 1935 would have cost a Catholic leading lady, knew that open acknowledgement back then would very likely have ended both her parents' careers. She was not writing to destroy Loretta Young. She was writing to complete Judy Lewis, to finally own both halves of herself in public, to hand her own daughter and grandsons the family history she herself had been denied. She said as much. She had to claim her father and her mother out loud, she explained, so that the children who came after her would never have to feel like half a person the way she had. Loretta Young did not see it that way. When the book came out, she refused to confirm a word of it. She would not give the story credence, dismissing it in public as the kind of romantic notion a lot of people like to believe, waving it off as rumor, rather than the confession she had made to her daughter's face in 1966. And she cut Judy off completely. For about 3 years, mother and daughter did not speak at all. The wall Young had built around the secret in 1935 was still standing, still doing its work, still keeping the two of them apart nearly 60 years later, even after everyone else on Earth had been told. Think about the endurance of that silence. Loretta Young was, by now, an old woman. Gable had been dead for more than 3 decades. Both careers had long since been made and lived. The world had already heard the story from Judy's own book. There was nothing left to protect but her own private peace with her God. And still, she could not say it, because saying it was confessing the mortal sin, and confessing the mortal sin to the public was a thing her faith would not let her do. Her refusal was not really about Hollywood anymore. It had stopped being about the studios a long time ago. By the end, it was between Loretta Young and the ceiling of her own church, a matter she could only take up in prayer. And prayer, in the end, is apparently what brought her back. In the later 1990s, after years of reflection, Loretta Young reached back out to her daughter. The reconciliation was quiet and partial. There was a Christmas invitation, a resumption of contact, a softening. They found their way back to something. But even then, even at the end, they did not reopen the subject of Clark Gable. It stayed sealed. They could be mother and daughter again, cautiously in the time they had left, but only if the sin at the root of them remained unspoken between them. Some doors, once shut long enough, cannot be opened even by the people who shut them. They can only be walked around. Loretta Young died in the summer of 2000 at 87. She had been a working star for the better part of the century, an Academy Award winner for The Farmer's Daughter, a pioneer of television, whose anthology program had brought her into American living rooms every week, famous for making her entrance through a door in a swirl of a gown, the picture of grace and faith and propriety to the very end. She had protected that image for 65 years, from the snow on Mount Baker to her last breath, and she had never once, while she lived, told the world in her own voice that Judy was her daughter and Clark Gable was the father. She had, however, allowed for it to be said after she was gone. That was the bargain she could make with herself. An authorized biography, prepared with her cooperation, was published around the time of her death, a book called Forever Young, and in it at last, the truth was confirmed from Loretta Young's own side. Gable was Judy's father. There had been, the book said, a brief fling on that long-ago picture. It was the acknowledgement Judy had waited her entire life to hear, and it arrived only when her mother was safely beyond the reach of the shame, spoken from the other side of the grave. Young could confess the sin at last, but only on the condition that she would never have to be alive to hear the response. There is a mercy in that and a final withholding in it too, both at once, which is the way almost everything went between these two women. Judy got the acknowledgement. She got to hold, at last, a book that said in plain print what her whole life had been organized around denying, that Loretta Young was her mother and Clark Gable was her father, and none of it had been rumor. But she got it in a form her mother could not be hurt by, could not be shamed by, could not even be asked about because her mother was gone. The confession and the disappearance arrived in the same package. Judy could finally be publicly claimed, only once there was no longer anyone alive to claim her in person, no one to embrace across a table and say the words while looking her in the eye. She was acknowledged and orphaned in the same stroke. After a lifetime of things arriving too late, this was the last of them, and in some ways the gentlest, and in some ways the cruelest. And she took it, because by then she had a great deal of practice at taking what she could get. So the promise the world made about that biography was kept. The truth came out, but truth that arrives after everyone is dead has a way of solving nothing for the people who needed it while they lived. And Judy was still living, and the questions she carried were not the kind a book could answer. Most of those questions were about her father, and she spoke them aloud in the years after the memoir, in the interviews she gave. And they are the questions of a child who was never allowed to be one. She wondered why he had stayed away. She wondered whether he had wanted her, whether he had ever wanted a child at all, what he had been thinking during that single afternoon in the living room when he held her face and said nothing. She was not angry so much as bewildered by the size of the absence. When a reporter asked what she would say to him if she could, she gave an answer that cut straight to the bone. She said she would ask him where he was when she needed him. She would ask him why he stayed away. And then, having asked, she would tell him how much she had missed him. That is the whole of it, really. Where were you when I needed you? It is the question underneath the entire story, the one the little girl in the bonnet could not have formed, and the grown woman could not stop forming, addressed to a man who had been dead for decades, and who had never in life given her the chance to ask it while he could still hear. There is a detail that shows how deep this ran, and it involves a movie you have almost certainly seen. In Gone with the Wind, the picture that made Clark Gable immortal, there is a little girl, Bonnie Blue Butler, the daughter his character adores, and there are scenes of Gable as a doting father, tender and playful and utterly devoted to his small daughter. Judy could not watch those scenes without weeping. Of course she could not. There up on the screen in glorious color was her father being the father to a fictional child that he had refused to be to her. He could play devotion for the camera. He could cradle a make-believe daughter and break the audience's heart with his love for her. He simply could not do it for the real one sitting somewhere in the dark, watching him do it for someone else. She had to watch her own father lavish on a character, the thing she had spent her life starving for, and she had to watch it knowing that the tenderness was real, that he had it in him, that he had just never turned it toward her. That is a particular kind of pain, and she carried it quietly for years. And yet, and this is the measure of the woman she became, she did not let it curdle into hatred, not of him and not of her mother. She held the pain and she also held the understanding, both at once, the way she had learned to hold the relief and the grief. She knew what 1935 had been. She knew that if her parents had done the honest thing, if they had stood up and claimed her and each other, the studios would very likely have destroyed them both, that there would have been no Loretta Young and no King of Hollywood, that the whole glittering structure of their lives would have come down. She understood the trap they had been in. She could even say, in her more generous moments, that within the narrow room her mother had allowed herself. Loretta Young had in some ways been a good mother, had provided and protected, and, in her constrained and frightened way, loved. Judy did not excuse the damage. She simply refused to pretend the people who caused it were monsters, because she had spent her life being the object of everyone else's simplifications, and she would not do it back to them. That refusal is the heart of what makes her story more than a scandal. The easy version has villains in it, a callous father and a cold, vain mother, sacrificing a child on the altar of fame. Judy knew better, because she had lived close enough to both of them to see the fear underneath the coldness. Her mother was not cruel by nature. Her mother was a woman raised to be looked at, who had built her entire soul around being good, and who had then done a thing her faith told her was unforgivable, and who spent the rest of her life unable to forgive herself, and who could not embrace the living evidence of that unforgivable thing without embracing her own damnation. The distance Judy felt was not a lack of love. It was a mother flinching from her own guilt every single day. With her daughter caught in the flinch, it helps to remember what kind of world made the flinch necessary, because Loretta Young did not invent the machine that swallowed her daughter's first years. She was working inside a system that had been built with great care to make exactly this kind of secret possible. The studios of the 1930s did not leave scandal to chance. They employed men whose whole job was to make problems vanish. The fixers, the publicity chiefs, the people with connections at the newspapers, and the police stations and the private clinics. A star who got into trouble did not call a lawyer first. The star's studio called its fixer, and the fixer arranged things: the quiet payment, the buried arrest, the sudden convenient marriage, the trip abroad for reasons of health. It was an industry within the industry, dedicated to keeping the fantasy on the screen from ever being contradicted by the truth off it. And the gossip columnists, the Lowella Parsons of the world, were not enemies of this machine. They were part of it. They traded in access, and access meant printing the version the studio wanted printed, so that a fabricated adoption could be announced in a friendly column and land in millions of homes as heartwarming fact. Judy was not the only child hidden by that machine. She was simply one of the ones we happen to know about, because she lived long enough and worked hard enough to tell it herself. There were others, other babies quietly placed, other pregnancies erased, other young women sent on sudden vacations, and returned slim and smiling with no questions asked. The system produced these erasures the way a factory produces anything, routinely, efficiently, without malice and without mercy, because the product was the image, and the image had to be protected at any cost, and the cost was very often a child. Loretta Young reached for that machine because it was there, because it was what you did, because every instinct the industry had trained into her since she was a toddler, in front of a camera, told her that the way to survive a catastrophe was to make it disappear and never speak of it again. None of that undoes what it did to the little girl in the orphanage. But it does mean the finger cannot point at one cold mother, because behind the mother stood the studio, and behind the studio stood a whole country that wanted its movie stars pure and was happy to be lied to in order to keep them that way. The audience was part of the machine too. The lie existed because the public demanded a version of Loretta Young that could not survive the truth, and the studios simply gave the public what it paid for. Everyone's hands were on it. That is why it held for so long. A secret kept by one person is fragile. A secret kept by an entire industry, and by the millions who preferred the fantasy, is nearly unbreakable. And it took a lifetime and a memoir, and the death of everyone who might have been hurt by it, before the truth could finally stand up in daylight. There is one more thing the passing years did to this story. One final turn that arrived long after Judy thought she had told all of it, and it reaches back to that snowbound mountain and that overnight train, and troubles the very beginning of everything. For most of Judy's life, and in her own memoir, the start of the story was a romance, a brief affair. Her mother had fallen for Clark Gable, so the accepted telling went, and had even called him the great love of her life, and had grieved that she never married him. That framing gave the whole tragedy a bittersweet warmth at its root. However badly it ended, it began. People believed in love. Judy could think of herself, at least, as a child conceived in feeling, rather than in violence, and there was some comfort in that. Then, in 2015, 4 years after Judy herself had died, that comfort was called into question. The new account came from inside the family. Loretta Young's daughter-in-law, Linda Lewis, the wife of Young's son Christopher, said that late in her life Young had told a different story about that night. By this telling, the flirtation on the mountain had stayed flirtation, and the actual encounter happened on the train coming home, when Gable let himself into her sleeping compartment. And the reframing was more than a change of location. According to Linda Lewis, Young had watched a television discussion of the term date rape, a term that did not exist when she was young, and had asked what it meant, and had been told it described a situation where you trusted someone, where the setting felt safe, and where your refusal was simply not accepted. And Loretta Young had said, in effect, that this was what had happened between her and Clark. If that is true, then the whole shape of the story shifts. Then the thing Loretta Young spent her life calling her sin was not a sin she committed, but a wrong that was done to her, and she carried a lifetime of Catholic guilt for a violation that was never hers to be guilty of. Then the reason she could never speak the word aloud, never claim her daughter in daylight, never look at the child without flinching, was not only shame at a moral failing, but the buried, unspeakable weight of an assault she had no language to name. It would explain the depth of the guilt, which always seemed larger than a consensual affair could account for. It would explain why a woman, raised to believe that a good woman resists, would blame herself so totally, since her entire upbringing had taught her that if a man did not stop, the failure was hers. She would have spent 65 years apologizing to God for something she should have been comforted for. But you have to hold this the way you have to hold everything at the edges of this story, which is loosely, honestly, without pretending to certainty you do not have. This account is entirely secondhand. It came out after both Loretta Young and Judy were dead, and could neither confirm it nor respond to it. There is nothing from Young's own lifetime, in her own voice, publicly calling it an assault. It surfaced at a moment when the wider culture was finally, and rightly, reckoning with how many such stories had been buried, which gave it a context that both made it more believable and made some people more cautious about it. It sits at odds with the earlier accounts, including Judy's own, that spoke of a romance and even of love. And Gable, dead since 1960, could say nothing at all. Some who knew the family found it wholly convincing, the missing piece that made the guilt make sense. Others urged care, noting how memory can be reshaped by a new vocabulary arriving very late. Both responses are reasonable. The truth of what happened in that compartment went into the ground with the only two people who were there, and it is not ours to declare. What can be said is gentler and sadder than a verdict. Whatever happened on that train, Loretta Young experienced the whole of it as her own fault, and she carried that belief with the full seriousness of her faith for the rest of her life, and it poisoned her ability to love the child who came of it in the open, generous way that child deserved. Whether the poison came from guilt over a sin or guilt over a wrong she had been taught to call a sin, the effect on the little girl was the same. The mother could not look straight at her, and the daughter grew up feeling like half a person. And by the time anyone had the words to understand why, both of them were gone. She had asked in that late-life conversation that this final piece never reached Judy. Loretta Young did not want her daughter to learn that she might not have been conceived in love or even in an affair, believing in her way that it would only give Judy one more wound to carry. It is one of the few purely protective instincts in the whole account, a mother trying at the very end to spare her child a pain, and it is bitter that it should come at the close of a lifetime of secrets that had done nothing but wound. She kept one last thing hidden, and this time she told herself it was for love. Return for a moment to the reconciliation, because it is easy to rush past, and it deserves a longer look. In the last years of Loretta Young's life, after the estrangement, after the book, after the 3 long years of not speaking, the two women found their way back to each other. It happened slowly on Young's side, through prayer and reflection, the same faith that had built the wall, now nudging her to reach over it. There was a Christmas invitation. There was contact again, careful and warm. And there was one unbreakable rule that made the peace possible. They never spoke of Gable again, not once. The subject that had defined their entire lives together was walled off, and only by walling it off could they sit in the same room as mother and daughter in the time that was left. That is a strange kind of peace, and it is worth being honest about what it was and what it was not. It was not resolution. Nothing was resolved. The wound was not healed. The years were not returned. The questions were not answered. What it was instead was mercy. Two women who had hurt each other across a lifetime, one by keeping the secret and one by telling it, decided near the end to stop hurting each other, even though they could not stop the hurt from having happened. They chose to be together in the only way they still could, which was to leave the great unspeakable thing alone and simply be a mother and a daughter having Christmas. It was not enough. It was also perhaps all that was possible, and Judy took it, because a diminished mother was still more than no mother, and she had spent her whole life taking whatever fraction of that woman she could get. And then consider the woman the public still saw during all these years, because the gap between the private truth and the public image is almost too neat to be real. All through the decades of the buried daughter and the flinching guilt and the secret carried like a stone, Loretta Young was, to America, the very picture of feminine grace and Catholic virtue. In the 1950s, she became one of the first big movie stars to master television, hosting a weekly anthology program that ran for years. And she opened each episode with an entrance that a generation remembers, sweeping through a doorway in a gorgeous flowing gown, turning to the camera with a radiant smile, the embodiment of elegance and warmth and moral certainty. Families watched her come through that door every week. She was, to millions, the ideal of the gracious, godly woman. And she came through that door, week after week, carrying the things she could never say. The purity that was her product was built, in part, over the concealment of her own child. The image the whole country trusted was the very thing the lie had been told to protect. There is no cruelty in pointing this out, only a kind of vertigo, because both women were real. The gracious lady in the doorway and the frightened mother, who could not name her daughter, and they were the same person. And the grace was not fake, even though the story underneath it was. She really did have that elegance. She really did have that faith. She had simply also done a terrible thing to hold on to them. And she carried the contradiction through that doorway every single week and smiled at the camera and never let it show. If nothing else, you have to grant her the discipline. She performed wholeness for the world with the broken piece hidden the whole time. And she performed it beautifully, because performing had been her survival since before she could remember, and it never once failed her in public. It only failed her at home, with the one small audience that mattered most. Judy, for her part, chose the opposite path, and choosing it was the great act of her adult life. Where her mother had spent 65 years perfecting silence, Judy decided to speak. The memoir was the first and largest act of speaking, but it was not the last. She talked about her story in interviews, on television and print, carrying it into the open again and again. And there is something almost defiant in that repetition, when you remember that she had been raised inside a conspiracy of silence. A girl everyone had agreed to keep in the dark. She had been the object of other people's discretion her whole childhood. As an adult, she refused discretion. She would say the thing out loud and keep saying it, because saying it was the only medicine that had ever actually worked on the wound. In 2001, the year after her mother died, Judy sat down for a television interview with Larry King, and by then she could speak more freely than she ever had, because the woman who had begged her for silence was gone, and the posthumous biography had confirmed everything. She talked about the long public silence, about what the secrecy had cost her, about the strange fact that the confirmation she had waited a lifetime for had arrived only after her mother's death. She was by then an older woman herself, dignified and thoughtful, a trained therapist who had spent decades helping other people understand their own families, discussing the family that had shaped and wounded her with the same steady clarity she would have brought to a client's. She had turned herself into the kind of calm, understanding adult presence that the frightened little girl in the bonnet had never had. In a sense, she had grown up to become her own missing parent, the one who would sit with a child and answer the questions honestly, and never make her feel like a burden or a sin. That was the real shape of her recovery, and it is the part of the story that redeems it. Judy did not simply survive her childhood, she studied it. She trained in psychology and became a marriage and family therapist. And she chose to work with foster children, with adopted children, with families broken and remade by separation and secrecy. Think about the deliberateness of that choice. She could have run from everything her origins represented. Instead, she walked straight back into it, professionally, and spent her working life on the far side of the desk from children, living the exact confusion she had lived. The ones who did not know where they came from, the ones passed between caretakers, the ones who felt like strangers in a family that was not quite theirs. She knew what to say to them because she had needed someone to say it to her, and no one ever had. The wound became the qualification. The thing that had nearly destroyed her became the thing she used to help. There are not many cleaner examples of a person taking the worst of what was done to them and making it useful to somebody else. And she did the other thing too, the thing she said the memoir was for. She broke the chain. She had a daughter of her own and grandchildren, and she was determined that they would not inherit the fog she had grown up in. They would know exactly where they came from. They would have the full family tree, with Clark Gable at the top of one branch and Loretta, young, at the top of the other, named and claimed and spoken aloud. No bonnets, no orphanage, no dead father story, no whispered common knowledge that the child was forbidden to hear. She had been raised on erasure. She refused to pass erasure down, whatever else the truth-telling cost her. And it cost her a mother's silence for years. It bought that. Her descendants would be whole in the way she had never been. They would never have to walk through a mirror at 31 to find out who they were, because she had already handed them both halves at birth. That is what she meant when she said she had to claim both her parents publicly. It was not about revenge, and it was not even mostly about herself. It was about the people who came after, the ones who would carry her blood into a future she would not see, and her refusal to let them carry it blind. She had spent 31 years not knowing the most basic fact about her own existence. She made certain no child of hers ever would. Judy Lewis died on November 25, 2011 in Pennsylvania of cancer. She was 76. The obituaries all told the same story, the one she had finally forced into the daylight, identifying her as the secret daughter of Clark Gable and Loretta Young, and centering the book she had written to reclaim herself. She died as what she had spent a lifetime becoming, not the adopted girl, not the hidden clue, not the walking sin, but Judy Lewis, who knew exactly who she was and had said so out loud, and had made a life out of helping others do the same. It took her the better part of 8 decades to get there. She got there, but go back to her father now, one last time, because there is a shape to Clark Gable's own life. That makes the silence between them even harder to bear, and it is a shape that rhymes painfully with hers. By the time Judy was born, Gable was already the king, but the throne did not make him happy in the ways that mattered, and it did not give him the thing he seemed to want most, which was a family that was actually his. In the years right after that snowbound picture, he finally shed the marriage of convenience to Rhea Langham, and he married the one woman who appears to have reached all the way down to the frightened boy under the movie star. Her name was Carole Lombard. She was funny and profane and unafraid of him. She teased the king the way no one else dared. And by every account, she was the great love of his life, the person he was most himself with, the marriage that might have made a whole man out of him at last. He wanted a child with her. They tried, it did not come. And then, in January of 1942, with the country newly at war, Carole Lombard boarded a plane home from a trip selling war bonds. And the plane went down into a mountain in Nevada, and she was killed. Gable was destroyed. The man the whole world envied. The man who could have anything, lost the one thing he had ever truly had, and he never fully recovered from it. He went into the army during the war, flew combat missions over Europe, seemed at times almost to be looking for the death that had taken her, and came home older and harder, and hollowed out in a way the camera could not quite hide anymore. He married again, more than once, still reaching, always reaching, for the family and the belonging that kept slipping away from him. The king spent his whole life chasing the one role the studios could not write for him, which was father. Here is where the rhyme becomes almost unbearable. All those years he ached for a child, grieved the children he never had. With the wife he loved, married and remarried in search of a family, he had a daughter. She was alive. She was in Beverly Hills. She had his ears and his features, and for one single afternoon when she was 15, she sat across from him and told him about her ballet lessons, while he held the truth in his mouth and would not let it out. The man starving for fatherhood had a child he would not claim, and the child starving for a father had a father who would not claim her, and the two of them sat in the same room, and neither hunger was fed, because the whole world had agreed that feeding it would cost too much. They were two people reaching for the same thing across a distance of 3 feet, and the distance held. He did not get his family in the end either, not the way he wanted it. He made one last picture, out in the Nevada desert, a hard, strange film called The Misfits, working in brutal heat, insisting on doing his own physical scenes, a proud aging man refusing to be handled. It wore him down. Days after the filming ended, in the middle of November 1960, his heart gave out, and Clark Gable died at 59. Still the king mourned everywhere. And then, the final irony of the timing, a few months after he was buried, His last wife gave birth to a son, John Clark Gable, the one child he would openly claim and give his name to. And the boy was born into a world where his father was already gone. So the great irony of Gable's fatherhood held to the very end. The daughter he had, and would not claim, grew up believing him dead. The son he wanted, and claimed was born after he actually was. He reached for fatherhood his whole life, and he touched it twice. Once with a child he could not acknowledge, and once with a child he could not live to meet. The king of Hollywood, who could command any room and win any heart, never once got to simply be a father to a child who knew him and stood in front of him and called him dad. He kissed a forehead in a living room and walked away. That was as close as he ever came. There is a knot at the center of this story that never quite comes undone, and it sits inside Loretta Young's faith, the same faith that shaped every choice she made. Try to hold both edges of it at once, because the whole tragedy lives in the fact that they were the same edge. It was her faith that saved Judy's life. That has to be said plainly, because it is easy to lose in the long catalog of the mother's failures. When the studio path led toward a quiet, deniable abortion, the safe and expected solution that had erased so many other inconvenient pregnancies, it was Loretta Young's belief that stopping it would be a mortal sin that made her refuse. She chose to carry the child and bear the child and keep the child, at enormous risk to everything she had, because her God would not let her do otherwise. Judy Lewis existed at all because her mother's Catholicism would not permit the easy way out. In the strictest sense, the faith gave her life. And then that same faith made it nearly impossible for the mother to love the child in the open. The belief that had refused the abortion also insisted that the conception was a grave sin, and the child its living evidence. And so the very conviction that brought Judy into the world was the conviction that made Loretta Young flinch from her every day. The faith gave her a daughter, and then forbade her to claim the daughter. It saved the child and cursed the childhood. One belief did both at the same time with the same seriousness, and there was no way for Loretta Young to keep the part that gave life without also keeping the part that gave shame. She got them as a set. Judy got them as a set too. A mother's fierce protection and a mother's constant recoil, delivered together, inseparable for a lifetime. That is why it is wrong to call Loretta Young a hypocrite, and wrong to call her simply cold. A hypocrite does not believe. She believed with everything in her, and her belief cut both ways, and she lived in the cut. She could not resolve it because it was not resolvable. You cannot love a child fully in the daylight, while also believing that child is the proof of your damnation. And she tried to do both, and she failed at both, and she spent 65 years failing at both quietly, behind a doorway in a beautiful gown, smiling at the camera. There is no villainy in that. There is only a person trapped inside a contradiction. She did not have the tools to escape, hurting the person she least wanted to hurt, unable to stop. Judy came to understand this, though it took her most of a lifetime and a great deal of professional training to see it clearly. And what sharpened her understanding more than anything, what turned her abstract childhood ache into something she could finally name and work through, was becoming a mother herself. She married Joseph Tinney, the man who had accidentally told her the truth, and they had a daughter, a girl named Maria. And when Judy held her own newborn, something must have moved in her that no therapy could have reached on its own, because now she knew the weight of the thing from the other side. She knew what it was to look at your own child. She knew that whatever else had been true of Loretta Young's fear and faith and shame, there had been a baby in a blacked-out room in Venice, a real infant, and a young woman looking at that infant. And Judy now understood exactly what that young woman had been looking at, because she had looked at the same thing in her own arms. The distance her mother had kept was suddenly not just a wound Judy had suffered, but a choice she could measure against her own heart, and it made the wound sharper, and strangely, the forgiveness more possible, because she finally knew how much it would have taken to do it differently. Holding Maria was also, surely, what made the silence unbearable to pass on. A woman who has felt like half a person her whole life, looking down at a daughter who is whole, does the arithmetic without wanting to. She would not let this child grow up counting backward from a shrouded film shoot, or hearing the truth blurted out by a fiancé, or walking through a mirror at 31 to find her own name. Whatever Judy had inherited, she would not bequeath. The chain that ran from the boarding house mother to the movie star mother to the hidden daughter would stop with her, deliberately by her own hand. And the proof that it stopped was a little girl who knew her own grandfather's name. It is worth pausing on the other people who lived inside this secret, because a lie this large is never kept by one person, and each of the keepers had a reason that was human, even when the result was not. Start with the family machine that made the concealment work, because it was a family effort, and it ran on love as much as fear. Behind Loretta Young stood her mother, Gladys Belzer, the woman who had held the family together through poverty by running a boarding house and steering her daughters into pictures. And Gladys was not about to watch the great achievement of the family, a genuine movie star, be destroyed by a pregnancy. Her sisters closed ranks too. This was a household of women who had learned early that survival meant sticking together and managing appearances. And when the crisis came, they did what they had always done. They protected their own. The cover-up was cruel to the baby, and it was also from the inside, an act of fierce family loyalty. A mother and her daughters circling the wagons around one of their own, in the worst trouble of her life. Both things are true. The machine that hid Judy was built out of a mother's love for a different daughter, and the little girl was crushed between two kinds of devotion. Then there is Tom Lewis, the stepfather, the man whose name Judy carried, and who treated her by her account with a coldness she could never understand. It is easy to file him under the story's villains, the resentful stepfather favoring his own sons over the strange adopted girl. But look closer, and he becomes something sadder and more complicated, because Tom Lewis was lied to as well. He was never told the full truth. He married Loretta Young believing, as far as the record suggests, the same fiction the public believed, that Judy was an adopted child his wife had taken in. He was raising, as the odd one out in his household, a girl he did not know was his wife's own flesh, did not know was the daughter of Clark Gable, did not know was anything but a charity case that had come attached to the woman he married. His coldness, whatever else drove it, grew in the same poisoned soil as everyone else's confusion. He sensed something off in that house, some imbalance he could not name, and he responded to it the way a person responds to a thing they cannot see clearly, badly. He was not let in on the secret either, in his own way. It was one more person. The lie was worked upon, rather than one more person who worked it, and the marriage eventually failed, and the two of them divorced at the end of the 1960s. And you can read the whole thing as a house quietly rotting around a truth none of the people living in it were allowed to say. A secret does not only wound the person it is kept from, it warps everyone who lives near it, even the ones who think they know what is going on. Even the columnist has a place in this, Lowella Parsons, who printed the fake adoption story that closed the trap. She was doing her job as the system defined it, trading access for cooperation, printing the version the studio wanted printed, because that was the arrangement that let a woman like her hold power in a town run by men. She was not sitting in judgment on Loretta Young's baby. She was moving a piece of copy that served everyone's interests but the child's. And the child was not part of the calculation because children never were. That is not innocence. It is something more ordinary and more chilling than villainy, which is a whole set of people, each doing the sensible thing for themselves, and the sum of all those sensible things being a little girl in an orphanage, with no photographs and a fake name. You can go all the way around the circle, and you will not find a monster at the center of it. You will find a frightened young woman, a loyal family, a distant faithless father, a stepfather kept in the dark, a columnist doing business, a studio protecting an asset, and an audience that wanted to be lied to. Every one of them had a reason. Every reason was human, and the total of all those human reasons was the specific, measurable damage done to one specific child, who spent her life feeling like half a person and did not know why. That is the thing about this kind of story that the tabloid version always misses. There is no one to blame, and that is worse, not better, because a single villain could have been stopped. A whole world agreeing to look away cannot be stopped by anyone. It can only be survived, and then if you are strong enough, told. Think at the last about her name, because her name holds the whole story in miniature, and following it is the closest thing There is to an answer to the question we started with. She was born Judith Young, or Mary Judith by some of the shifting records, in a blacked-out room, and even that name was wrapped in falsehood. The birth certificate carrying a mother who was not the real mother, the baptismal papers arranged to mislead. Then she became, for the world, Judy the adopted orphan, a girl with no surname of her own, until her mother married and handed her the name Lewis. So she went through life as Judy Lewis, and the name Lewis came from Tom Lewis, the stepfather who never adopted her and never warmed to her, and was himself never told the truth. Before Lewis, the only surname available to her was Young, her mother's, which was itself a stage name invented to sound like stardom, not even the family's real name. Every name she was ever given pointed away from who she actually was. Not one of them was her father's. She was the daughter of the most famous man in America, and his name was the one name she was never allowed to carry. That is what it means to be a hidden child. It is not only that the truth is kept from you, it is that the truth is written out of you, scrubbed from your papers, edited off your face, replaced with names that belong to other people or to no one. Judy spent 31 years wearing a self-assembled, entirely out of other people's cover stories, and she felt the wrongness of it as a physical thing, a permanent low hum of not quite existing, and she could not have told you its source, because its source had been surgically and legally and socially removed from her reach. So when she finally learned the truth, and later when she wrote it down and said it out loud, and put it in the obituaries that would follow her, what she was doing was not gossip and not revenge. She was giving herself at last her real name, not Lewis and not Young, but the fact underneath both, that she was the daughter of Clark Gable and Loretta Young, conceived on a mountain or a train in the winter of 1935, hidden and denied and loved badly by frightened people, and that she had survived all of it and become a whole woman with a family of her own and a life spent helping other lost children find their way home. That was the name she claimed. It was the only one that had ever been true. What happened to Clark Gable and Loretta Young's daughter is that she was buried alive in a lie as an infant and spent half a lifetime digging her way out and got out. That is the answer. She did not die in the orphanage, though a part of her nearly did. She did not stay half a person, though she easily could have. She walked through the mirror at 31, and she kept walking, through the confrontation and the estrangement, and the memoir and the years of quiet therapeutic work, until the girl who had been a secret became a woman who told the truth for a living. The wound never fully closed. She said so herself, honestly, to the end. But she stopped bleeding into the next generation, and she died knowing exactly who she was. And for a person who began life with a false name, on a forged certificate in a room with the windows blacked out, that is not a small thing. That is very nearly everything. The strange thing is how close this secret has always been to you, if you are the kind of person who grew up on these faces, and how you carried it in your own living room for years without knowing. You have seen Clark Gable be a father. If you have watched Gone with the Wind even once, you have seen him lift a small girl onto a pony and glow, with a love so open it aches. And now you know that while he was doing that for the camera, he had a real daughter he would not lift, would not name, would not let call him what he was. You have seen him be tender. He had the tenderness in him the whole time. He simply spent it on a made-up child in Technicolor and withheld it from the real one sitting somewhere in the dark, the way she herself sat in the dark and watched him before she understood. And you have seen Loretta Young come through that door. If you are old enough, you remember her television program, the way she opened each week by sweeping into frame, in a gown that turned as she turned, radiant, gracious, the very picture of a good woman. And you trusted that picture. Everyone did. That was the whole point of it. Now you know what she carried through that doorway every single week. The image you trusted was built over the child she could not name. The grace was real, and so was the thing hidden underneath the grace. And she brought them both through the door together and smiled at you, and you never saw the seam. That was the discipline of a lifetime, performed for your living room. And it worked on you exactly as it was meant to. That is what the old studio system did, and did well, and did to people you loved from a distance your whole life. It gave you faces to adore, and made sure you never saw the cost of the adoring. The purity was a product. The romances were sometimes arrangements. The wholesome sweetheart and the rugged king were, some of the time, elaborate cover stories worn by frightened human beings, and the truth was kept from you, because you were part of the machine too, because you wanted the fantasy, and the fantasy could not survive the truth, and so the truth was folded up and hidden inside a bassinet and shipped off to San Francisco, and everyone agreed to look at the pretty version instead. You were not cruel for wanting it. You were just a member of the audience, and the audience was the point. Judy Lewis spent her life on the other side of that arrangement, the side the fantasy was built on top of. She was the cost, and when she finally stood up and told you what the pretty version had been hiding, she was not trying to spoil your memories of two beloved stars. She was trying to put a real person back into a story that had erased her, so that the next time you watched her father pretend to be a father, or her mother sweep through that door, you might feel, folded into the old familiar pleasure, the presence of the little girl who was standing just out of frame the whole time, in a bonnet, with her ears covered, being loved by nobody in the open. And so we come back to the living room, because that is where this began, and it is where it has to end. Picture it once more, but with everything you know now sitting in the room, alongside the two of them. A girl of 15 comes home from school on an ordinary afternoon and finds a big, famous man waiting, and she has no idea he is her father, and he knows exactly who she is. He says her name. You must be Judy. They sit. He asks about her ballet lessons and her school and her small, ordinary life, and he listens with the full warmth he could summon better than any man alive. And for half an hour, the two loneliest people in this whole story sit 3 feet apart and are, without either of them being able to say it, a father and a daughter together for the only time there will ever be. He had torn up the telegram announcing her birth. He had, if the story is true, once handed over money so she could have a proper bed instead of a drawer. He had let her mother build the orphanage and the false adoption and the pinned ears and the dead father lie. And he had stayed away for 15 years. And now here he was, and here she was half grown, with his own ears hidden by a surgeon's work, and his own features softened out of her face, telling him about ballet. Everything he had refused her was in that room. So was everything he could not stop himself from feeling. And at the end of it he stood, and he took her face in both of his big hands, and he kissed her once on the forehead, and he walked out the door, and she never saw him again. That kiss is the whole of what he was able to give her. Not a name, not a home, not the truth, not a single word that would have let her understand the man in front of her. Just a kiss on the forehead from someone she thought was a friend of her mother's, a small warm thing pressed onto a girl who had no idea what she was receiving. He gave her the most he could, and it was almost nothing, and it was also, in its way, everything, because she kept it for the rest of her life. When she was an old woman, a therapist who had helped hundreds of lost children, that half hour and that kiss were still there, more precious to her than they had any right to be, because they were the only proof she ever held in her own hands, that her father had looked at her and for a moment could not quite make himself leave without touching her face. He left anyway. That is the part that does not soften with the years. He had the whole world at his feet, the king of Hollywood, the man who could have anything. And he could not find a way to have this, could not or would not cross 3 feet of Beverly Hills carpet and tell his own child the truth. And she could not know to ask, because the entire apparatus of 2 careers and 1 church, and a whole industry, and a willing audience had been built, brick by brick, since before she was born, precisely to make sure she never would. The distance in that room was not really between 2 people. It was the accumulated weight of everyone who had ever chosen the pretty version over the true one, pressing down on a father and a daughter until they could not reach each other across a coffee table. Here is the wiser thing, the thing that only comes clear from the far end of the story. The tragedy was never that Judy Lewis did not know her father. Plenty of people never know a parent, and they build whole lives anyway. The tragedy is that she almost did. Twice, a door opened. Once when he cupped her face and kissed her forehead, and once in 1966, when her mother finally spoke the truth after a lifetime of silence. Both times the door opened, and both times it was too late or too guarded to walk through. The father already committed to leaving, the mother already old and ill, and unable to give the truth, without also demanding it be buried again. She got the truth, but only after he was dead. She got the kiss, but only without the knowledge to feel it. Everything she was owed arrived, eventually. It just arrived in the wrong order, and always a little too late. And that is a particular kind of heartbreak, the near miss that keeps almost being a rescue. She made it whole anyway, as much as a person can. She took the wrong order truth and the too late kiss, and the falsified name, and the years of feeling like half a person, and she assembled out of that broken material an actual, complete, examined life. And then she spent that life making sure other lost children did not have to assemble themselves alone. She could not go back and make her father claim her, or make her mother name her in daylight, or restore the photographs that were never taken of her first 2 years. She could only do the one thing that was left to her, which was to refuse the silence, to say out loud and in print, and to her own descendants the thing that everyone had spent a lifetime making sure she could not say. She was the daughter of Gable and Loretta Young. She had known her father for one afternoon and had not known it was him. She had loved a mother who could not look at her without seeing a sin, and she was not half a person, not anymore, not by the end. The photograph of that living room does not exist. No one took it, of course. There was never going to be a picture of Gable sitting with his secret daughter, because the whole point was that it never happened officially, that she was somebody else's adopted orphan, and he was just a family friend passing through. But you can see it anyway if you let yourself.